The lantern's glow trembled in the wind as the caretaker spoke, his eyes fixed on the dark row of graves. "Your boy comes here every night," he said softly. "You should see why." I thought my son was still mourning his father. I was wrong. Nora Bennett lives at the edge of a small rural town where the cemetery backs against her field. It's been 2 years since her husband's sudden death, and her 10-year-old son, Liam, has grown quiet, gentle, distant, lost in thought. She assumes his nightly walks toward the cemetery are his way of saying goodnight. The caretaker, an aging man named Reed, tends the grounds with patience and silence. But when he appears at Nora's porch one cold evening, lantern flickering in his trembling hand, she realizes Liam's grief hides something far deeper than remembrance. The knock came long after the house had gone to sleep, not loud, just deliberate. 3 measured taps. By the time I opened the door, the wind had already slipped inside, and there he was, Reed, the cemetery caretaker, his lantern shaking in the dark. The flame inside it leaned sideways, nervous, the way light gets when it doesn't want to tell the truth. He didn't take off his hat. He just said my name, low and careful. "Nora," he whispered, "it's about your boy." It was late October, the kind of night that presses its cold face against the window pane and waits to be invited in. The stove had gone out hours ago. I was sitting by the kitchen table mending the sleeve of Liam's coat when the knock came. Our house stands on the edge of town, where the pavement ends and the earth starts remembering things. From the back window, you can see the cemetery, a slope of gray stones that catch the moonlight like quiet eyes. Since his father's passing, Liam had gone there every evening after supper. He said he liked talking to him, to Dad. Sometimes I watched from the porch, his small figure crossing the field, his flashlight bobbing through the mist. I let him go. You don't tell a 10-year-old how to grieve. You just let him find his own silence. But that night, when Reed's lantern flickered in my doorway, something heavy moved behind his eyes. He was a thin man, older than I remembered, his face carved by wind and worry. He held the lantern between us like an apology. "I wouldn't have come this late," he said, "if it wasn't every night now." "Every night?" I repeated. My voice came out softer than I meant. He nodded. "Near 11, sometimes later, always to the same spot." "Well," I tried to smile, "his father's there." Reed didn't smile back. He just looked past me into the dark hallway as if the house might answer for me. "It's not his father's grave he visits," he said quietly. The air between us turned to glass. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, the lantern sputtered, struggling for breath. I asked him to come in, but Reed shook his head. "No need," he said. "Best if you see for yourself." He looked like a man who'd already said too much. I followed him to the gate. The night had thinned to fog, soft and colorless. Dew clung to the iron fence. It made the metal glisten like it was sweating. Reed's boots made no sound, just the whisper of grass giving way. He kept the lantern low, lighting the path in slices. I wanted to ask him where Liam went, whose grave he meant, but each time I opened my mouth, the cold stole the words. We passed the main rows of headstones, the familiar ones, the old veterans, the farmers, the names that sounded like home. But Reed didn't stop there. He took the narrow path that curved toward the far edge of the cemetery, the older side where the stones leaned and the names were half-eaten by moss. He finally stopped near a small clearing surrounded by birch trees. Their white trunks gleamed faintly in the lantern's reach, like bones arranged to listen. "There," he said, nodding toward the slope. I followed his gaze. The ground was uneven, fresh-turned. A shallow mound of soil glimmered wet in the moonlight. Footprints, small ones, led up to it, pressed deep, and next to them, the mark of a small shovel. My breath caught. "He's been digging." Reed didn't answer right away. He set the lantern down beside the mound. "I've covered it over 3 times this week," he said. "Each morning I find it open again." He rubbed his hands together, the way men do when they're trying to erase a thought. At first I figured it was animals, but I saw him tonight, kneeling right here, hands in the soil like he was praying into it. He paused, searching my face. "Mrs. Bennett, that grave's got no one in it." The wind moved through the birches, restless and thin. I stared at the ground, at the dark earth my child had touched, and the sound of my heartbeat filled the world. I wanted to speak, to say it was impossible, that Reed must have been mistaken, but the ground didn't care what I believed. "He's just a boy," I whispered finally. "He's lonely." Reed shook his head. "He talks to it, Nora. Stay for an hour, sometimes 2. Tonight he was whispering something I couldn't catch." The lantern's light trembled between us. The flame inside seemed to grow smaller, as if trying to hide from what we'd said aloud. I knelt by the mound, reaching out to touch the soil. It was cold but soft, freshly turned, like bread dough before the oven. My fingers came away damp. The smell rose, not rot, not death, but something old, clean, unexplainable. "Whose grave is this?" I asked. Reed hesitated. "There's no marker left. Might have been a child's plot long before my time. The records are gone. This whole corner's older than the town itself. A child's plot." The words landed heavy, spreading through me like frost. For a moment I thought I saw something pale under the dirt, a petal or a scrap of fabric. But the lantern's light shifted, and it was gone. Reed straightened, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I'll keep watch tomorrow night. Just make sure he stays home, will you?" I nodded. "Yes, of course." But even as I said it, I knew I wouldn't. I would come instead, quietly from the edge of the field, to see what my boy was whispering to in the dark. Reed picked up the lantern and started back toward the path. When he reached the gate, he stopped and turned. "If he goes again," he said softly, "don't call out to him. Just watch." The flame inside his lantern wavered once, then steadied. He touched the brim of his hat, then vanished into the fog. I stood there long after he was gone. The night had turned colder, the kind that sharpens every sound. The drip of dew, the sigh of trees, the far-off cry of something waking in its sleep. I looked down at the grave one last time. The footprints around it were small and familiar, the same muddy tracks that trailed through my kitchen each morning, my son's. When I finally turned back toward home, the lantern's glow was already a memory fading between the stones. Each step I took felt heavier, as if the earth wanted to keep me close, to whisper what it knew. At the porch, I looked toward the cemetery once more. The mist had thickened, wrapping the birch trees in white veils. Somewhere beyond them, the ground I'd touched was waiting, and I knew, before I even reached the door, that this was only the beginning. Whatever had called to my son from that empty grave, it wasn't finished speaking. The clock struck past midnight when the sound woke me. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of one. The house was too still. The old radiator usually sighed in its sleep. The trees outside usually brushed the siding. But that night, even the air seemed to hold its breath. I turned on my side. The other room should have been glowing faintly from the nightlight. A small blue star Liam refused to sleep without. But there was no light, just dark. A coldness uncurled in my stomach. I sat up and listened. The bed springs creaked under me like an old secret. Still nothing. No sound of his breathing, no restless tossing of the blanket. I slipped out of bed, the floorboards meeting my feet with a chill that reached bone. When I opened his door, the first thing I noticed was the smell. That faint, warm smell children leave behind. Soap, dust, something like sunlight caught in fabric. The second thing I noticed was that the window was open. The curtains swayed gently, like a slow heartbeat. Outside, the frost glowed silver, each blade of grass tipped with light. and far off, crossing the field toward the dark slope of the cemetery, a small, moving point of light, his flashlight. My breath stopped. "Liam," I whispered. But the word didn't leave the room. I didn't think to put on shoes. The cold grabbed me first, a sharp, wet cold that bit at the edges of my feet. But I didn't stop. The night pressed close, full of quiet, watching things, the kind of silence that listens. The beam from Liam's flashlight flickered ahead, steady, deliberate, moving with the rhythm of small determination. He wasn't running. He wasn't lost. He was going somewhere he'd gone before. I crossed the field, the frost crunching softly beneath me. The moonlight made everything strange. The fence, the trees, the shapes of things I thought I knew. My breath came out in small ghosts. When I reached the gate, it was already open. He must have learned how to lift the latch without sound. The iron felt like ice when I touched it. Inside, the world was pale and dreamlike. Stones like teeth, the grass a thin gray carpet, the sky wider than it had any right to be. And there, at the far corner where the birch trees bent low, a small shape on its knees, Liam. The flashlight lay on the ground beside him, its beam cutting sideways across the dirt. He was whispering. I could see his breath rising in soft bursts. His hands were pressed flat to the earth, fingers spread as if he were feeling for something buried deep beneath. "Liam," I wanted to call out, but Reed's words came back to me. "Don't call out, just watch." So I stood behind a narrow birch trunk, holding my breath, the bark cool against my cheek. His voice was low, uneven. I could only catch fragments. "I didn't mean to. I tried to fix it. Please don't be mad." He paused, looking at the ground as if listening for an answer. The stillness was unbearable, so pure it seemed alive. Then he nodded, just once. "Okay," he said softly. "I'll bring it tomorrow. I promise." The wind moved through the birches, carrying the sound away before I could make sense of it. He stayed kneeling there for a while, rocking slightly, his head bowed. It didn't look like play, it looked like confession. Something inside me began to splinter, not from fear, but recognition. He had his father's way of holding still when the world became too heavy, the same tilt of the head as if listening for something only he could hear. I wanted to go to him, to touch his shoulder, to pull him back into the world that had light and warmth in it, but the space between us felt sacred, like I'd be trespassing on something holy or broken. I couldn't tell which. He lifted his face then, and the light caught it. The pale shimmer of tears tracing down his cheeks. He wasn't crying out loud. He was too careful for that. The tears just slid quietly, like they'd been waiting their turn. His lips moved again. I leaned forward, trying to catch the words. "You said it was safe here," he murmured. "You said you wouldn't go away again." My heart twisted. "Who are you talking to, baby?" I whispered, too low for him to hear. The beam of the flashlight flickered and dimmed. Liam stood slowly, brushing dirt from his knees. His breath came out in a long sigh, tired, small. He looked down once more at the unmarked stone, then pressed something into the soil. A small shape. I couldn't tell what it was from where I stood. Maybe a toy, maybe something else. Then he turned and began to walk back toward the gate. I waited until he passed the last row of stones before I moved. The frost underfoot crunched louder than before, echoing in the silence. When I reached the grave, the flashlight's dying beam gave me just enough to see what he'd left there. A folded piece of paper. I bent down. The air around the mound felt colder, as if the frost had chosen this spot to gather its strength. The paper was damp around the edges, but the writing was still visible. Small, crooked letters that leaned into each other like frightened children. "I'm sorry," I told. "Please come back." The words hit like a quiet blow. Told what? Told who? The paper trembled in my hand, or maybe it was me. The flashlight went out completely then, swallowing everything in darkness. For a moment, all I could hear was my own breathing, harsh, uneven, too loud for this place. When I looked up, the fog had thickened, the birches blurred, their white skins melting into gray. I felt the strange pull of the ground beneath me, as if it knew my name. The unmarked stone stood silent, its face pale and clean, no moss, no inscription. I touched it. Cold. But under the cold there was something else. A faint warmth, a vibration, like the hum of buried wires. I drew back my hand quickly. The night seemed to lean closer. From somewhere beyond the trees came a sound. Soft, rhythmic. Not wind, not animal. It was the sound of small feet running through frost. "Liam," I whispered, and turned toward the field. He was almost home by then, his shape already swallowed by the mist. I folded the note carefully, pressing it against my chest as if to keep it warm. Then I followed. Each step back to the house felt longer than the last. The frost clung to my feet, the grass crackled like thin glass. When I reached the porch, I stopped and looked back. The cemetery lay silent, its stones glinting like dull teeth under the moon. But one light still burned, faint and orange, near the caretaker's shack. Reed's lantern. Watching. I slipped inside, locked the door, and leaned against it, heart hammering. Upstairs, the window in Liam's room was still open. The curtain breathed slowly, in and out. I went to close it. On the sill, a smear of dirt traced the outline of small fingers. 5 of them, pressed firm. I stood there a long time, listening to the wind move through the house, and wondered what kind of grave could listen back. Morning came late, dragging a pale sky behind it. The fog had not lifted. It just thinned enough to show what it wanted me to see. From my kitchen window, the field looked harmless again. Just frost, just fence, just earth, pretending it doesn't remember. But I knew where the soil had been touched, where my son's footprints had settled in the night. The kettle hummed on the stove, but I didn't wait for it to boil. I tied my coat too tightly and stepped into the cold. The world smelled of metal and sleep. The grass crunched under my boots as I crossed the field. The same path Liam takes every evening when he thinks I'm not watching. The sun was small and tired, its light weak as watered milk. Each step I took felt heavier than it should have, as if the ground didn't want me coming back. I kept thinking about that note, folded and damp, now sitting on the kitchen table like a small confession. "I'm sorry," I told. "Please come back." I hadn't asked Liam about it yet. I wanted to. God knows I wanted to. But he'd been so still at breakfast, tracing circles in his oatmeal, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The cemetery gate squealed softly when I pushed it open. By day, the place looked older, more fragile, not haunted, just tired. The stones leaned toward one another like gossipers at a funeral. I found the path by memory. The birch trees were easy to spot, their trunks bright against the dull grass, standing like pale witnesses to something no one had written down. When I reached the grave, the first thing I saw was color. A small red toy car sat at the base of the stone. Its wheels were clogged with mud, its paint chipped at the corners. I knew it instantly. It was Liam's. The same one he'd begged me not to throw away last spring, the one I'd finally tossed in the trash after it broke in half. Yet here it was, whole again. I crouched down, brushing frost from its hood. The metal was cold enough to sting. He must have carried it here in his pocket, all this time. But why leave it now? And why here? This grave with no name, no story left to tell. The stone itself was almost flat, swallowed by the years. Whatever name it once bore had been erased by rain, as if someone had wanted it forgotten. The ground beneath it dipped slightly, a shallow sink where the earth had exhaled too long ago. I knelt and ran my hand over the surface. The texture was strange, rough at the edges, smooth at the center, like hands had touched it too many times before. I could smell the damp stone, the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. Footsteps sounded behind me. I turned. Reed stood a few yards away, hat in his hands, lantern unlit. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "I figured you'd come back," he said. His voice was quiet but not unkind. We stood there for a while, both looking at the grave. "The boy leave that?" he asked, nodding toward the toy. "Yes," I said. "Last night." He bent down, squinting at it. "It's funny," he murmured. "Toys find their way here sometimes. Little things. Marbles, ribbons, hairpins. Always right around this corner." "What is this place?" I asked. "This section. It doesn't look like the rest." Reed took a long breath, as if measuring how much truth to give me. "Used to be part of the hospital grounds," he said. "Children's ward. Burned down in the 60s. Place went up quick. They never rebuilt." He rubbed the brim of his hat between his fingers. "The bodies they found, some were too charred to move. They buried them right here, quick as they could. Never marked proper. Records got lost when the county changed hands." He looked at me then. "Nobody visits these graves anymore. Haven't for decades." My chest tightened. I glanced at the small car again, gleaming faintly in the cold light. "But someone has been," I said. Reed nodded slowly. "Your boy." The wind moved through the birches, their thin branches whispering over us. I looked down at the earth, at the toy pressed neatly against the base of the stone. Liam hadn't just stumbled onto this place. He'd chosen it. "Do you remember the fire?" I asked. "Before my time," he said. "But my father worked these grounds. He told me some of it. Said they never figured out how it started. Thought maybe a lantern. Kids were trapped in the upper rooms. They found drawings on the walls later. Pictures, names, things children make when they're scared." He looked toward the trees. "When I was little, he'd bring me here to remind me to keep my matches put away. Said if you listened close, you could still hear them crying." He caught himself then, shaking his head as if scolding his own words. "Just old talk," he muttered. But the silence that followed didn't feel like old talk. It felt like something listening. I crouched again, tracing the edge of the stone with my fingertips. "What if Liam found something?" I said softly. "Something from the fire." Reed frowned. "Like what?" "I don't know, a toy, a drawing, something small." I hesitated. "Last night he said he'd bring it tomorrow. Maybe that's what he meant." Reed looked uneasy. "If he did find something, best you take it from him. Some things don't want to be remembered." I stood and brushed dirt from my hands. "I can't take his grief from him, Reed. I can only follow where it goes." He nodded. "Then just be careful where it leads." We stood together in the still air, the field stretching wide behind us. The sky had started to clear, thin blue showing between torn clouds. The light touched the stone, and for a second, the grooves of a name surfaced beneath it. Faint, almost legible. Then the shadow returned, and it was gone again. I stayed after Reed left, alone with the silence. The frost had melted where the sunlight reached, but the ground around the grave stayed cold. I picked up the toy car and turned it in my hand. The wheels still spun. On the underside, carved faintly in the metal, were 3 letters scratched by hand. Liam's toys never had names. The birch trees creaked softly behind me. The sound was gentle, almost like laughter, almost like weeping. I set the toy back down on the earth and stepped away. When I looked back one last time, the car had caught a shard of sunlight, a small, defiant gleam against the gray, the kind of light that doesn't stay. And in that moment, I wasn't sure what frightened me more, that my son had found the grave, or that the grave might have found him first. It started as a normal wind, the kind that rattles the shutters, moves the laundry on the line, makes you think the world is still breathing. But that night, the wind came differently. It didn't pass by the house. It circled it. It stayed. I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, the lamp by the door flickering every time a gust leaned close. The sky was a dull gray bruise, moon hidden somewhere behind it. From here, I could see the outline of the field, the faint black rise where the cemetery began. Nothing stirred, but the air felt like it was trying to speak. The sound came in fragments, soft, broken syllables that almost became words before falling apart. At first, I thought it was the wind passing through the old birches, their white bark peeling like paper skin. But then I heard something clearer, threaded beneath the gusts. A tone too steady to be chance, a whisper shaped like laughter, Liam's laughter. The blanket slipped from my shoulders. I leaned forward, listening. It was faint, but I'd know that sound anywhere. That half-laugh, half-giggle that came when he was talking to someone he trusted. But there was no one to talk to out there. At least, there shouldn't have been. I looked toward his window. Dark. The clock inside ticked too loudly, its rhythm uneven, as though the house had caught my pulse. "Liam?" I called softly into the dark. The sound barely made it off the porch. The wind carried it away like it didn't belong to me anymore. For a moment, the field went still. Then came another whisper. Not a laugh this time, but words. Too faint to catch, too human to ignore. My skin prickled. I rose and stepped off the porch. The frost had thinned since morning, but the ground still glittered with dew. The grass was cool against my bare ankles. I walked a few paces into the yard, straining to see movement in the field. The moon broke through for a second, a pale eye in the clouds, and in that short light, I saw him. A small figure crossing the lower field, moving fast, not sneaking this time. The beam of his flashlight jumped in the dark like a nervous heartbeat. Liam. "Liam," I whispered again, louder, but he didn't turn. The wind rose suddenly, folding my voice into its mouth, and within it, faint and chillingly clear, came another voice, a child's voice. Not Liam's. Higher, thinner, carried perfectly by the current. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was calling back. The porch light flickered again. I took one step toward the field, then stopped. The memory of Reed's warning echoed like a nail struck in wood. Don't call out to him. Just watch. So I did. I stood rooted to the earth, watching that small shape vanish into the gray mouth of the cemetery. And then there was silence. A deep, hollow silence that made the wind sound like breath between sentences. The minutes stretched thin. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to nothing. The world had gone colorless, just shades of ash and bone. Then faintly I heard him laugh again, softer this time, closer. A single quick burst, joy, not fear, and then quiet. When the sound came again, it was the gate creaking open. A shape moved through the fog, small shoulders, a flashlight swinging loosely in one hand. He was humming under his breath, something tuneless, something that didn't sound like it belonged to a child. I stepped back onto the porch as he approached. The wind pushed around him like it didn't dare touch. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looked up at me and smiled. Not sheepish, not caught, just calm. "Hey, Mama," he said. His voice was steady, soft as sleep. I opened my mouth, but the words stuck. There was mud streaked across his knees, up to his shins, black and wet. His hands were dirty too, small crescents of soil under the nails. And something else, a faint, sweet smell like old smoke and lilac. "Where were you?" I managed. He blinked, surprised by the question. "With him," he said. "Who?" He tilted his head slightly like he was trying to decide how much I already knew. Then he said it. Simple. Small, final. "He's not lonely anymore." The wind moved across the porch, making the lamp shiver. I tried to ask, "Who isn't? Who are you with?" But the words felt too large, too clumsy to fit through my throat, and Liam was already stepping past me. He went straight inside, the boards creaking beneath his feet. I followed quietly, afraid of breaking something fragile between us. He didn't go to the bathroom. He didn't wash the dirt off. He just climbed into bed, pulling the blanket to his chin. His flashlight lay beside the pillow, its beam dimming slowly to nothing. I sat on the edge of his bed. "Liam," I whispered, "who are you talking to?" His eyes were already half closed. "You heard him too?" he mumbled. I froze. He smiled faintly, a child's sleepy smile, the kind you see before the world hardens them. "It's okay now," he murmured. He said thank you. And then he turned over and fell into deep, even breathing. I stayed there a long time, listening to that breathing. It was the only sound in the house. No wind now, no whisper through the cracks, just the steady rise and fall of his small chest. I brushed the dirt from his sleeve with the edge of my hand. It came away easily, leaving a faint brown stain on my fingers. When I lifted them to my nose, the scent hit me again, not just soil. Ash. My stomach turned. I rose slowly, moving toward the window. Outside, the field was quiet. The fog had thinned to a low mist, glowing faintly under the returning moon. Everything was still. But as I stood there, another sound drifted through the half-open window. The barest hum, a child's voice caught in the tail of the wind. Not words this time, just a sound, almost like singing. I looked down at Liam. He was sound asleep, his face peaceful, untouched. The sound didn't come from him. The song continued, light, uncertain, and heartbreakingly small. It circled the house once, twice before fading toward the field. When it was gone, I shut the window. The lamp flickered one last time before dying out completely. In the dark, I stood listening to the house breathe, the soft moan of old wood, the sigh of the stove cooling down, and under it all, something new. A faint echo of the voice, low now, whispering just beyond hearing, like the wind had learned to speak his name. I touched Liam's hair, cold with the night still clinging to it, and whispered to no one, "Then who's lonely now?" The question didn't need an answer. The silence that followed already had one. Reed's shed sits at the edge of the cemetery, a square of tin and shadow, half swallowed by ivy, the kind of place that always looks like it's waiting for someone to open the door first. He called me there just after sunrise, said there was something I needed to see. His voice over the phone was steady, but too quiet, like he was holding it together by habit. The sky was still gray when I arrived. A mist hung low, curling around the gravestones like it was listening in. When Reed opened the door, a puff of damp air spilled out. Paper, oil, time, the smell of places that remember too much. Inside, the light came from one small window, a square pane covered in cobwebs. It turned everything the color of old bone. Reed's desk was covered in ledgers, thick cloth-bound books stacked like sleeping beasts. Some had string around them. Some looked half-burned. He'd already cleared a space in the middle, a single ledger open to a page near the back. He nodded toward the chair across from him. "Sit, if you want," he said. His hands were blackened with dust, fingertips cracked from years of soil. I sat. The chair creaked like it was warning me. He didn't look up when he started speaking. "Been trying to make sense of the old section," he said. "The one your boy keeps going to." He flipped through a few pages, careful not to tear them. The sound of the paper was soft, like breathing. "These ledgers go back to the early 1900s, he went on. "Names, dates, sometimes even causes of death, all in the same hand." He smiled faintly. "My, father's hand, mostly." The pages were spotted with mold, corners eaten away. Each line told a small story. Mrs. Edna Pierce, 1938, pneumonia. Infant unbaptized, 1941, found in the river. Tiny, almost invisible lives. Reed stopped turning pages. His finger rested on one entry that looked different from the rest. Half of it was blackened, the ink blistered by fire. The surviving words were just enough to understand. Unnamed boy, age approx. 8. Found near Chapel Fire, 1963. I stared at it. The shape of those letters burned into my eyes. The word unnamed looked like it had been written twice, as if someone couldn't believe it the first time. Found near, I repeated softly. Not inside? Reed shook his head. No, that's what's strange. The report says he wasn't in the building when it burned. He was found at the edge of the chapel field near where the old oak stands now. He glanced at me. That's right, next to the grave your boy visits. A sound escaped me, something between a breath and a question. I looked back at the page, at the way the ink bled into the paper like veins. Was there a name later added? I asked. No. Reed's voice carried the weight of years in 2 syllables. They didn't find a family, no school record, no birth certificate. No one came forward, so they buried him quick. Fire victims were piling up that week. He leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. I always thought maybe he was one of the orphans from the ward, but... He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window. I felt something around that grave for years. The room went still. I could hear the slow tick of a clock on the wall. Faint, irregular. Reed's eyes were somewhere far away when he spoke again. You ever hear something when you shouldn't? He asked quietly. Like wind that don't move right? Or humming that sounds almost human? I didn't answer. Not yet. He gave a small, uneasy laugh. I'm no fool, Mrs. Harris. I don't go chasing shadows. But some nights, when the fog's thick and the trees get to moving, I hear it. He looked down at his hands, palms flat on the table. A soft tune, just a few notes, like a boy humming to himself while he works. Sometimes it comes from the far side of the yard, sometimes from right outside this shed. His voice fell to a whisper. And when it stops too clean, like something noticed me listening. The light dimmed behind the clouds. Dust floated in the beam from the window, drifting between us like slow snow. I tried to speak, but my throat wouldn't open. I kept seeing Liam's face in my mind. His soft smile, the dirt on his knees, his whisper before sleep. He's not lonely anymore. I reached for the page. My fingertips brushed the burned edge. The ash crumbled softly beneath my nail. Was there anything buried with him? I asked. Reed blinked. What do you mean? Objects, clothes, toys, anything. He hesitated. Don't think so. The record says, wrapped in blanket, unclaimed effects, none. He paused, then frowned slightly. Why? I looked down at the page again. Because my son had left a toy at that grave. One I'd thrown away, because he'd gone there in the dark talking to someone who answered back. But I couldn't say any of that. Not yet. Reed closed the ledger carefully, brushing his hand across the cover. The smell of old smoke rose with the movement, faint but sharp. You think your boy's seeing things? He asked. I shook my head. No, I think he's feeling something. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I'd said. There's a difference. He went to the shelf and slid the ledger back into its place among the others. The wood creaked. Something small, a curled piece of black paper, fell from between the pages and landed on the floor. Reed bent to pick it up, but I was faster. It was a scrap of photograph, melted at the edges. Just enough of it remained to show a corner of a child's sleeve. White cotton, a button missing. Nothing more. I turned it in my hand. The paper was stiff, brittle as a leaf. Reed looked over my shoulder. That might have been attached to the report once. We found it years ago stuck to the inside cover. Do you remember finding it? He hesitated. No, he said. I remember hearing the humming, though. I placed the scrap gently on the table. The light through the window caught it, and for a second it gleamed faintly, as if oil still lived in the burn. Why does he come to that grave? I murmured. The question wasn't for Reed, not really. He didn't answer. He just sighed. A long, weary sound that seemed to deflate the whole room. I don't know, he said finally. But if it were my child, I'd keep him close tonight. He looked at me then, the deep lines of his face etched with something that wasn't quite fear, more like sorrow borrowed from someone else's story. I stood. My knees trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of the air. Reed followed me to the door, pushing it open. The morning light spilled in, soft and thin. From here, I could see the edge of the field, the line of birches, and beyond them, the grave that had no name. The wind moved across the grass, low and steady, carrying something faint with it. A hum. Just a few notes. I looked back at Reed, but he'd already gone inside, pretending not to hear. The hum lingered, turning once around me before drifting off toward the trees. And for the first time, I understood what it meant for something to be both lost and waiting. The fog arrived first, slow, deliberate, like something that had been waiting for permission. It crept across the fields and gathered at the fence line, swallowing the stones one by one until the world turned to milk. We left the car by the gate. The headlights looked embarrassed, their beams thinning into nothing. Elias walked ahead of me, a small lantern swinging from his hand, its light barely holding its shape in the mist. Somewhere ahead, I could hear the soft scrape of Jacob's voice, low, steady, half prayer, half whisper. The path to the grave was softer tonight, as if the ground remembered us. Each step sank deeper than the last. The fog made it hard to tell where the earth ended and the sky began. Elias didn't speak. He never did when we came here. He just carried the light. I could taste rain that hadn't yet fallen, that damp electric taste that makes you think of endings. The birches stood like thin ghosts, their bark shining faintly through the mist. When we reached the old section, Elias stopped. His breath came out in quick, uneven clouds. "There," he whispered, and lifted the lantern. Jacob was kneeling by the grave, one hand pressed flat against the soil. His coat hung loose around him, the collar turned up, his hair damp from fog. The stone in front of him looked darker than the rest, new compared to its neighbors. I didn't have to look at the name carved into it to know it was his brother's. The fog swirled low, curling around Jacob's hands like smoke drawn to a flame. He was speaking again, the same rhythm he used when he read bedtime stories to our son. Gentle, familiar, as if the person beneath the ground might still be listening. We stood there for a long time, neither of us moving. The air was heavy, wet, full of the small sounds the world makes when it wants to stay quiet. The drip of water from the trees, the hush of wind pushing through grass. Then Jacob's head lifted slightly. "He's listening," Elias whispered almost to himself, and for a moment I believed him. The fog shifted again, and I could see Jacob's fingers tracing lines in the dirt, slow and careful, like he was mapping something invisible. He tilted his head to the side, as if straining to hear an answer. A faint smile moved across his face. Small, almost painful in its tenderness. Elias moved closer, but I caught his sleeve. "Don't," I whispered. Something in the air told me that any sound too loud would shatter what was happening. The lantern flickered once. In the weak light, the soil near Jacob's hand seemed to move. Not much, not even enough to call it shifting. It just breathed. A rise and fall, subtle as the flutter of a pulse beneath skin. I blinked hard, thinking it was the fog playing tricks, but Elias had seen it too. He stepped back. The lantern trembled in his hand. Jacob didn't react. He just whispered, "It's all right. It's just the air finding a way out." And then, quieter. "He's not angry anymore." I couldn't stay still anymore. The distance between us, 10 steps, maybe less, felt like the longest I'd ever walked. I moved toward him, each step slow, each breath catching in my throat. "Jacob," I said softly, "come away now." He didn't turn. His hand was still pressed to the dirt, his lips still moving. I crouched beside him. The earth smelled of iron and wet leaves, the kind of smell that stays on your hands no matter how many times you wash them. "Jacob, please." He turned his head just enough for me to see his face. His eyes were open wide, unfocused, as though watching something just beyond the fog. "He's close," he murmured. "He's right beneath. Can you feel it?" I almost said no, but the ground shifted again, softer this time, more deliberate. A hollow sound like breath released from under pressure, then stillness. Jacob smiled faintly. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. "I don't hear anything," I said. He looked down again. "That's because he's talking to me." The wind picked up suddenly, moving in a slow circle around us. It carried with it the faintest tune. No words, just notes, thin and sweet, the sound a child makes when trying to remember a lullaby. Jacob's lips moved in rhythm with it. I reached for his shoulder, but my hand stopped short. I was afraid to break the air between us, afraid of what might answer if I did. The wind died as quickly as it came. The fog sank lower, folding itself around the graves like a closing book. Jacob lowered his hand, palm black with soil. The smile was still there, but smaller now, worn at the edges like a memory too often held. He exhaled once, slow and certain. "He's resting," he said simply, and stood. Elias lifted the lantern higher. Its glow brushed the grave just long enough for the letters to appear through the mist. Elias Jacob Moore, 1990-2015. The name my husband shared with his brother. The fog shifted again, and the ground beneath the stone seemed to sigh. A single breath, then still. We turned toward the gate, walking slowly, careful not to disturb what had quieted. Behind us, the wind moved once more, a whisper against the grass, soft as a promise not meant for us to hear. The house was too quiet to be trusted. Even the old clock seemed to hold its breath between ticks. I sat by the window with my robe pulled tight, watching the frost settle over the field. It made everything shimmer. The grass, the fence, the memory of warmth. When the clock finally struck 2, its sound was too sharp, too alive. That's when I saw him, a small shadow cutting through the pale mist, moving with purpose. Liam, again. The flashlight in his hand swayed like a heartbeat, steady and unafraid. I should have gone to him right away. But I didn't. I just watched. The cold pressed against the glass, my breath leaving pale ghosts that kept fading too quickly. His small figure crossed the field the same way he always did. Quiet, certain, like he was following a path only he could see. The grass glowed silver beneath the moon, each step of his feet parting it like water. I glanced toward the clock again, 2:07. Every night, he went a little later, stayed a little longer. I told myself it was sleepwalking, a phase. But no child sleepwalks with a flashlight. When he reached the fence, he didn't stop. The gate opened for him as if it had been waiting, and in the distance, through the fog, the old cemetery began to take shape. Stones rising like tired bones, the birches bending low as if listening. I grabbed my coat. The floorboards groaned beneath me, the same way they did when my husband was alive and the night stretched too long. Outside, the air felt sharper, thinner, the kind that finds its way under your skin and stays there. I followed the light. The fog thickened halfway through the field. I could only see the faint glow of his flashlight now, a small star pulsing near the far corner. The air smelled of wet leaves and something metallic, like the breath before rain. When I reached the edge of the cemetery, I stopped. The gate was still swinging open, its hinges murmuring softly. I slipped through and stayed low, my steps careful, my breath shallow. Liam was kneeling at the grave again, the unmarked one. The soil looked freshly turned, darker than the rest, as though it had been touched too recently. He was whispering, not the way children mutter in play, but slow, deliberate, as though reciting something. Each word left his mouth like it already knew where it was going. I leaned closer. "Don't worry," he said softly. "She doesn't understand yet." The fog seemed to pulse with his voice, and then, from the other side of the grave, came another sound, faint, brittle. A whisper that didn't belong to him. It wasn't echo. It wasn't wind. It was reply. The small hairs along my arms rose, and I pressed a hand to my mouth before the sound could escape me. The reply came again, clearer this time, like breath pressed through damp cloth. Not words, but shape, intention, a rhythm that mimicked speech. Liam nodded gently, as if listening to a friend. The beam of his flashlight trembled, catching the edge of his face. Eyes soft, peaceful, distant. He looked older in that moment, impossibly older. I took one slow step forward. The frost cracked under my foot like glass, and both voices stopped. Liam's head turned slightly toward me, but he didn't startle. He didn't even look surprised. He just said, "You'll wake him." His voice carried no fear, no rebellion, and only quiet warning. "Liam," I whispered, but the sound went nowhere. It folded into the air and died, like the wind had swallowed it. Somewhere in the distance, Reed's lantern flickered on in his shed, a single orange glow trembling through the fog. It should have been comforting, but it only made the night feel smaller, tighter. Liam lowered his flashlight and placed it beside the stone. The grave's surface looked like it was breathing again, slow, shallow movements beneath the frost. My heart pounded in my throat. "What is it, Liam? What's there?" He didn't answer. His hand hovered above the earth, fingers trembling. "He doesn't like being alone," he murmured finally. "He just wants to be warm." The fog rippled once more, like something beneath had sighed. I don't remember walking back, only the sound, the soft drag of my boots through the wet grass, the echo of the gate closing behind me. The air felt heavy, thick with the kind of silence that stays inside your chest. From the window, I could still see the lantern burning in Reed's shed, flickering like an eye refusing to close, and beside it, the faintest light of Liam's flashlight left behind, resting against the grave. I pressed my palm to the glass. It was cold, but beneath it I could feel warmth, faint and steady, as if something unseen had followed me home. The clock struck 3. Liam's bed was empty again. I didn't look for him this time. Somehow, I knew he wasn't far, and for the first time, I wondered, what if the child buried there never stopped listening? The morning broke without birds, just a gray light spilling over the fields, pale and uncertain. From the kitchen window, I saw Reed's lantern swaying through the fog, slow, measured steps toward the old section, his figure bent low, shoulders drawn tight like a man expecting something he already dreads. The frost was still clinging to the fence line, and the grass had gone stiff and white. He stopped near the grave my son loved most. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong. The earth wasn't flat anymore. It had shifted. It had breathed. I found Reed kneeling in the same spot where Liam always did. One hand pressed to the ground, the other holding his lantern close, as if light could undo what he was seeing. The grave was open. Not dug, not disturbed by tools, but pushed from beneath. The soil had lifted unevenly, curling at the edges like a handprint pressed too long into sand. Frost melted in thin veins across the mound, steaming faintly in the morning chill. Reed didn't look at me when I approached. "Don't step closer," he said softly. His voice was stripped bare, not fear, just reverence. I stood behind him, my boots sinking into the wet earth. "What happened?" I asked. He ran his fingers through the soil, spreading it apart gently. "No shovel marks," he murmured. "No footprints, but ours." The fog thinned enough for the light to reach the hollow in the center of the grave. It wasn't deep, just enough to suggest something had surfaced, then settled again. Inside it, half buried, was a photograph. The paper looked untouched, too clean for where it lay. Reed lifted the photograph carefully, brushing the dirt from its edges. His hands trembled. It was a black and white print, soft focus, the kind of image that feels like memory more than moment. A group of children stood outside the chapel, each holding a small candle. Their faces were turned toward the lighted window behind them, a window I recognized from the old ruins near the woods. The chapel that burned. Reed turned the photo toward the gray light, squinting as if the picture might change. None of the children looked older than 10. Some smiled, some didn't. "That's the chapel," I whispered. He nodded once. "Before the fire." He pointed at the corner of the photo, the faint outline of a calendar nailed to the wall just behind them. "November 1963, he murmured. "That's the night of it." The photo was perfect, edges crisp, paper dry. No sign of decay. It shouldn't have survived. It shouldn't have been there at all. I looked at Reed, waiting for him to make sense of it, but his face had gone pale, the color draining away like ink in water. "They didn't make it out," he said finally. "All those children. Their names are in the ledgers. Only one wasn't." I didn't need him to finish. I already knew which one he meant. The wind moved then, slow, curling through the grass like it was carrying a memory. Reed held the photo close to his chest, staring down at the disturbed ground. "You ever notice how still the air is here?" he asked quietly. "Like something's waiting for permission to breathe again." I looked down at the soil. It had settled slightly, as though the ground was calming itself after effort. The hollow was shallow, shaped like the curve of a child's hand. Reed exhaled. "There's a reason your boy hears what he does. He's not imagining it." The words hung there between us, heavy as frost. "What do you mean?" Reed's eyes found mine. "I think they speak through him. The ones who never got their names written right. The ones who were left behind." I wanted to laugh, or cry, or deny it, but the sound wouldn't come. My mind flashed to the nights Liam returned with dirt on his hands, the way he whispered before sleep, the faint hum that sometimes followed him into dreams. Reed knelt again and placed the photograph back where he found it, pressing the soil over it gently. The earth gave way easily, like fabric being tucked around something precious. "Best to leave it where it was," he said softly. "Some things come back up because they still need to be seen." When we stood, the fog had thinned enough to see the chapel ruins in the distance. Its stone walls were black with soot, its windows open to the sky. Reed turned off his lantern. The morning light felt colder without it. Liam's toy car still sat at the base of the grave, half buried in the frost. Beside it, a single candle stub had appeared, unlit, its wick perfectly clean. I hadn't seen Liam bring it. The wind moved through the birches once more, and for a moment it sounded like children's laughter, faint, distant, caught somewhere between worlds. Reed bowed his head. "Every grave has a reason," he said. "But this one remembers." I looked at the small mound of earth, the place that had opened and closed on its own, and I thought, maybe the dead don't haunt us. Maybe they just want to be heard. The power went out just after dusk, the kind of blackout that feels deliberate, like the house itself exhaled and went still. I lit a single candle and watched the flame bend toward the hallway, as if it knew where the truth was hiding. Jacob stood in the doorway, his face pale against the dark. He didn't move until I said his name. Even then he didn't answer, just stepped closer, eyes wide and distant. "I need to tell you something," he whispered. His voice sounded older, not scared, just tired of keeping secrets. The kitchen felt smaller that night, walls closer, shadows thicker. The candle's flame wavered, painting the room in gold and ash. Jacob sat across from me, hands flat on the table, like a child reciting a prayer. He wouldn't meet my eyes. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the windows, long, slow breaths that seemed to listen more than move. I poured him a cup of warm milk, though neither of us drank. When he finally spoke, his voice barely rose above the crackle of the candle. "It started with the wind," he said. "It knew my name." He looked up then, not at me, but at the empty space between us, as if the voice might be sitting there too. "I thought it was Dad," he said, "at first." His small fingers twisted the edge of his sleeve. It sounded like him when he used to tuck me in. The words hit soft, but they stayed sharp. I wanted to tell him ghosts don't borrow the voices we miss most, but I didn't. I let him keep talking. Jacob's story came in pieces, like torn pages held together by silence. "The voice," he said, "used to come only when the wind moved through the field. It called me from outside, real gentle. Said my name once, then again, like it was learning how to say it right." He glanced toward the window. The fog had gathered again, thick against the glass. "After a while, it started using other names," he continued, "not just mine. Sometimes it called me Peter, or Thomas, or Eli." He said the names carefully, as if afraid of waking them. "Did you answer?" I asked. He nodded once. "At first, I thought maybe it was lost. It said it wanted to go home." The candle hissed, its wax pooling at the base. He leaned closer, his voice low. "When I told it I didn't know where home was, it got quiet. Then it said, 'I do.'" My chest tightened. "What did it mean, Jacob?" He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time I saw something I couldn't name in his eyes. Not fear, not guilt, recognition. "I think it knows where I sleep," he said softly. I didn't breathe for a long moment. The wind rattled the window once, short and sharp, like punctuation. Jacob's hands trembled in the candlelight. "It said I could help it find home," he whispered. "Said it needed someone who still remembers." His voice broke slightly. "I told it about Dad's letters, about how you said they keep his memory here. I thought maybe the voice was trying to write back." I felt something cold rise through me. The letters, the ones I found under Jacob's pillow weeks ago, written in his father's handwriting, though no one had taught him the loops and slant. He must have seen the change in my face. "I didn't mean to," he said quickly. "I just wanted to make it happy. It said if I wrote what it told me, it could rest." He stared down at his milk, untouched. But then it changed. The words weren't like before. It started talking about fire and children who couldn't wake up. My throat went dry. I remembered the photograph Reed found at the grave, the children with candles, their faces soft, unknowing. Jacob's voice thinned to a whisper. "Mom, I don't think it's just one voice anymore." The candle burned lower, its light unsteady. The shadows on the wall began to move like they were breathing. Jacob's eyelids drooped, his voice fading to a whisper. "I told them I'd help," he murmured. "I said I'd bring them home." He fell asleep there at the table, his head resting on his arms. The flame guttered once, then steadied, small but defiant. I reached across and touched his hair, tracing the line of his temple, the warmth still there beneath the skin. Outside, the wind moved through the fields again, whispering names I didn't recognize, each one careful, patient, as though searching for the right ear to hear them. I blew out the candle, but the sound didn't end. It stayed in the room, soft, circular, waiting. And in that moment, I finally understood. Not every voice wants to be remembered. Some only want to be let in. By morning, the wind had stopped. The silence felt wrong, too neat, too sudden, like a curtain drawn over something unfinished. Aaliyah stood at the edge of the porch, holding a folder wrapped in twine. His breath clouded in the cold, though the air didn't move. He didn't look at me when he said, "I found something." The words carried no victory, only weight. I followed him inside, where the table still held Jacob's candle from last night. It had burned down to its stub. Wax pooled like milk around its base. I knew before he opened the folder that it would change everything. The papers were old, yellowed, brittle, and smelled faintly of smoke. Elias untied the twine with steady hands, though I could see the tremor in his fingers. "These are from the town archives," he said. "Property deeds, blueprints, inspection reports, and something else." He slid a folded map toward me. It showed the town as it was 50 years ago. Where the cemetery sits now, there used to be a single building, square, with 2 wings and a small courtyard. Across the top, faded letters read, "St. Catherine's Home for Children." I traced the outline with my finger. Beneath it, in a different ink, someone had written one word in the margin: "Condemned." Elias exhaled. "The fire started in the West Wing, 1963. They tried to evacuate through the cellar." He turned another page. A list of the dead. Names half missing, some marked unidentified. And below the list, a short note from the coroner's office. "Remains reinterred at Hillcrest Ground." My hand went still. "Elias," I whispered. "The cemetery." He nodded. "They built it right over the orphanage. The cellar runs beneath the lower graves." The wind outside stirred once, faintly. A sigh or a reminder. Jacob sat on the floor near the window, drawing in the fog that clung to the glass. Tiny fingerprints smeared across the surface, little circles that caught the light. He hummed to himself, the same quiet tune he'd used when whispering at the grave. I knelt beside him. "What are you drawing?" He smiled without looking up. "Places," he said, "where the children go when they stop being cold." In his lap were scraps of paper, small notes folded carefully, tied with bits of string. Each one had a name. Some I recognized from the coroner's list. Others didn't belong to any record. "I've been giving them toys," Jacob murmured, "so they don't have to wait alone." He pointed toward the door, toward the field beyond. "They said they were scared of the dark, so I buried my light-up car too." I felt something break softly inside me. Not fear, something gentler. A kind of grief for children who never had anyone to tuck them in. Elias came to stand beside us. "We should do one more," he said quietly, "for all of them." Jacob nodded, eyes bright with something like relief. He picked up one last folded note, written in his small, crooked hand. It said only, "You're safe now." Night came early. We walked to the grave with Elias leading the way, his lantern cutting a slow arc through the fog. The ground was damp, the grass whispering under our steps. The air carried no wind, only stillness that pressed close, as though listening. Jacob held the note to his chest, his fingers smudged with dirt. When we reached the grave, he knelt without being told. Elias and I stood behind him, the lantern's glow flickering against the stones. Jacob dug with his hands, small scoops of earth, gentle and careful, like uncovering something fragile. He placed the note inside, then looked at me. "Can I say it, Mom?" I nodded. His voice was steady. "You're safe now." He pressed the soil back over the letter, smoothing it flat with his palm. The night seemed to lean in, holding its breath. Then, for the first time in months, the air shifted. Not sharp, not cold, just soft. Like the exhale of something finally at rest. The birches moved slightly, their leaves whispering without sound, and beneath it all came a quiet hum. Faint, harmonic, the kind of sound you feel more than hear. Elias raised his lantern higher, but the light no longer trembled. The grave lay still. We turned to leave, our steps slow through the dew-soaked grass. Jacob slipped his hand into mine. For once, it was warm. The night around us felt wider. The fog thinning, the stars beginning to return. Somewhere far behind, I thought I heard laughter, light and distant, fading toward the trees. Elias walked ahead, the lantern bobbing in rhythm with his stride. Its glow brushed the ground, then dimmed suddenly just once. He paused, looked back. The flame steadied, but weaker now. as if the air had changed again almost imperceptibly. Jacob glanced over his shoulder at the grave. "They're quiet now," he said. His tone wasn't relief. It was wonder. We kept walking until the light from the lantern was all that remained between the earth and dark. And I thought, maybe peace doesn't stay. Maybe it only visits, like a breath that pauses before the next wind begins. Winter came softly that year. The frost lingered longer on the windows, but the nights were quieter. No whispers beneath the eaves, no humming from the fields, just the sound of Liam breathing, steady, unbroken, through the thin wall between our rooms. I used to dread that silence. Now, I let it stay. The clock on the mantel ticked like a heartbeat too slow to matter. Outside, the birches had lost their leaves, their bare branches sketching the sky. And in that stillness, I began to believe that maybe the world had finally stopped holding its breath. Weeks had passed since that last night at the grave. Each morning Liam woke later, eyes clearer, laughter coming easier. He didn't mention the voices anymore. Sometimes, though, I'd find him by the window before dawn, his small hand pressed against the glass, watching the frost bloom across it like tiny white rivers. He never said what he was looking for, and I never asked. The air inside the house had changed, lighter somehow, though the rooms were still the same. Even the floorboards seemed quieter when I walked across them. Peace, I thought, doesn't arrive loudly. It just takes the place of fear, one corner at a time. Reed hadn't come by in weeks. I'd see the faint glow of his shed lantern sometimes at dusk, a single steady light in the distance, no longer flickering, no longer restless. He used to call that the graveyard's pulse. Now it was just light. That morning, as I poured water for tea, a shape moved across the porch. Tall, slow, familiar. The kettle hadn't yet boiled when I heard his knock. Reed stood there with his hat in one hand and the lantern in the other. It wasn't lit yet, but I could see the glass, clear, spotless, the metal polished bright. He looked tired, though not worn, just quieter inside himself. "Morning," I said. He nodded, eyes fixed on the lantern. "It doesn't flicker anymore," he said simply. "Thought you should have it." I stepped aside to let him in, but he didn't move. Instead, he set the lantern down on the porch rail, careful, deliberate. The sunlight hit it and broke into small, warm shards across the wood. "I cleaned it out," he went on. "No soot left, no oil leak. Burns steady now. Been steady for days." He paused. "Guess it doesn't need me anymore." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. Like he wasn't talking about the lantern at all. Liam came to the door then, still in his pajamas, his hair a soft mess of sleep. He didn't say a word, just stood beside me looking up at Reed, then at the lantern. After a moment, his eyes dropped lower to the porch floor. That's when I saw it. The toy car, clean, shining, resting beside the lantern as if it had been waiting there all along. Reed knelt, the boards creaking under his weight. He picked up the toy car, turning it in his hand. The red paint gleamed, bright, new, untouched by dirt or time. "I thought this was buried?" he said quietly. "It was," I answered. My voice came out smaller than I meant it to. Liam stepped forward, his bare feet whispering against the wood. "They brought it back," he said. The way he said it, soft, sure, left no room for disbelief. He didn't mean it as something strange, just true. Reed looked up at me, his eyes full of the kind of understanding that asks for nothing. Then he set the car beside the lantern again and stood. "I think they're done wandering," he said. His gaze moved toward the field, pale under the morning sun. Maybe they just needed someone to light the way out. For a long time, none of us spoke. The air was utterly still. No wind, no movement, just the faint hum of life continuing, the way houses sound when everyone's awake but no one's talking. When Reed finally left, he didn't take the lantern. He didn't look back either. He just walked down the path until the fog took him. The flame inside the glass burned steady, unblinking, sure. That evening, I sat on the porch with the lantern between my hands. Its light was soft, gold that didn't waver. The toy car caught its reflection, glowing faintly beside it. Inside, Liam slept soundly, his breaths even, his small hand curled around the edge of his blanket. Through the open window, I could hear the night pressing against the trees. No whispers, no humming, just the stillness that comes when something lost has finally found its way home. I looked out toward the cemetery, where the grass shimmered under moonlight. For the first time in months, it looked like nothing more than a field. No secrets, no fear. The lantern's glass stayed clear, its flame unmoving. I whispered, more to the night than myself, maybe peace isn't silence at all. The wind didn't answer. It didn't need to, because in that still light, I understood. Maybe peace is just love learning how to stay.